Morning.
Hey, hi everybody. This is Joanne Manister, and I'm sitting here in Illinois, surrounded by an ocean of corn, as usual, and in the summer anyway. And I am joined by my co-host Jeff, who is over in Maryland. And today we have as our guest Cynthia Barnett, a returning guest. We are so happy to have Cynthia back with us. And she has written a new book. Her last book was Rain, and that was great to read. So that's why we were so excited to have a new book by Cynthia. This one is called The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of the Oceans. And it's a really well put together book about different shells and, of course, some history and anthropology, etc. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you. It's nice to talk to you both again.
Let me go ahead and read a brief bio so people know who you are if they are not familiar already. So Cynthia is an award-winning environmental journalist who has reported on water and climate change around the world. Ms. Barnett is also the author of Rain, A Natural and Cultural History, long listed for the National Book Award and a finalist for the 2016 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. Congratulations. Well deserved, actually. I like this. The Globe describes Ms. Barnett's author persona as part journalist, part mom, part historian, and part optimist. Oh, yeah, we need the optimism, don't we? The Los Angeles Times write that she takes us back to the origins of our water in much the same way, with much the same vividness and compassion as Michael Pollan led us from our kitchens to potato fields and feedlots of modern agribusiness. That's nice. Ms. Barnett has written all the places our great science journalists have written: National Geographic, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, etc. Many other publications. You have a background in journalism, water science, and history, and that's really cool. And it shows in your books. And you teach environmental journalism at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communication in Gainesville, where you live with husband and teenagers.
Yes, and one teenager has flown away since. I have a teenager who just finished his freshman year in college, and we have missed him, and we didn't get to drop him off at college because of COVID. And so he actually goes to Leiden in the Netherlands, and in a few weeks we will finally get to go and see him, and I get to see his dorm. So I'm very excited about that.
So exciting. Yeah. Although the Netherlands has had a spike in cases, so please be careful.
We will. And he's staying in his dorm right now. So he's vaccinated and in a bit of hibernation again.
Wow. Congratulations. That's exciting. So, well, actually, I saw movement behind you. So you're sitting somewhere that's not just the typical, and you're not sitting in your house.
Oh, I'm not even sitting in Florida. I live in Gainesville, and I am sitting in Nantucket. And I had the computer with a different view earlier so that we could all see the lovely little village of Nantucket on the outside, but it made my face go completely dark and you couldn't see me. So I had to turn, but at least you get to see the barometric pressure and the like. So I am in Nantucket because I've been invited to speak tonight by a wonderful group called Remain Nantucket. It is part of an effort funded by the philanthropist Wendy Schmidt to work on resilience in Nantucket, defined by not just environmental resilience in the face of rising seas and storms, but also social and economic resilience. So the neat thing about talking about mollusks to this community is that they're sort of the most resilient animals ever, right? They survived 500 million years of evolution. They lived through 5 mass extinctions. They are, it's all about sustainability, and they're sort of the world's most sustainable architects. So the other neat thing about the talk tonight is that I'm speaking in a church, and it is this beautiful First Congregational Church. And I mean, that's been a surprising thing to me as a science author over these years, how often I've been invited to speak in churches and synagogues and other places of worship. And I think that's a beautiful thing and a really important thing, just to be able to reach a broader audience. And that's something I've very much tried to do with this book. But I'll tell you a quick story about that. I went yesterday afternoon to check out the venue. And it's this, you know, if you look up Nantucket Church in the dictionary, this church would be there. It's imagine. And I walked in and I was talking to the minister about, you know, hey, do you have any seashell stories? And he said, well, there are those scallops on every cross we give every baptized person. And I said, what? And he went and got these crosses, and they are absolutely beautiful crosses with a bay scallop mounted to each one. And it is the keepsake that they give every person who's been baptized in the church. And it was just such a beautiful reminder of the importance of seashells, and specifically scallops. You know, throughout human history, and very much in Christianity, from St. James forward, as you remember from that chapter. So, of course, I woke up early this morning and rewrote the top of the talk, all about those beautiful little crosses. It was really a neat moment.
Oh, that's really beautiful, though. I would love to see one.
Yeah.
Next time I stop by Nantucket.
The one thing that I remembered as we were looking at this, but I hadn't started the book yet, but what I remembered from reading Rain and talking about it was that of all the beautifully written books we've read, your writing is really like no one else's.
That's true.
And it's
thank you.
I would love to be able to tell everyone who might be watching, here's what you will get out of this book and the things that she talks about, except there is so much history and so much narrative, so much poetry, so much beautiful work, so many ideas. It's awfully hard to figure out what's going on, but we can say, you know, the book says it's about seashells, and it certainly is. And then it also says seashells and the fate of the oceans, and you do that too, and it covers a lot of ground. And so there's just all these stimulations as I was reading that, especially because it relates to some other people that we've talked to recently. And there's a lot going on about oceans, and its importance, and climate change. But where I really want to ask first, because as I first started learning about evolution and things like that, and then history, one thing that has continued to surprise me is that European culture didn't recognize fossils the way we do until well into the 19th century. They thought they were natural formations, perhaps put there by God to convince us to admire the world or something like that. And I would like to contrast that a little bit with two remarks. One is a remark, one is a quotation for your book, and then ask the question that's been on my mind, as Joanne knows, for a while. Very early on, you talked about a shell museum, someplace, this may have been in Florida, but it doesn't really matter. And you said 90% of visitors to the shell museum had no idea that a shell is made by a living animal. Most people thought they were stones. That's kind of shocking. And then 20 pages after that, you pointed out, this is not quoting, that Zuni people versus modern people recognized the meaning of fossil shells, where they were, how they fit into a bigger history and a deeper time and their past. And so now I'm wondering about what you would have to say then about that contrast between people's cultural notions and also my theme that Joanne knows, how those cultural notions and preconceptions influence the progress of scientific understanding in the world versus someone like the Zuni people who have seen things for a much longer time.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And you know, Jeff, I noticed it with both rain and seashells. You might remember in rain, the Americans were super excited about weather science very early on. The
Mhm.
Europeans were still hanging on to some of the witchcraft days and very worried about forecasting. They were afraid of forecasting, didn't believe in the science of forecasting,
Mhm.
and actually halted forecasting for
That
years,
could be a dangerous
which
thing to
was
do.
surely dangerous.
Yeah.
In the United States, it was the opposite. You know, Thomas Jefferson, the founding forecaster, he loved weather forecasting. You know, Americans got very into weather forecasting very early. And and I actually hadn't thought about that contrast before you said it, Jeff, but it was true as well in the story of fossils. But earlier, like with the Zuni. And the interesting thing to me about the Zuni people was that, you know, you hear the Greeks, you hear that the ancients were so smart and they, you know, recognized fossils and they were the first to do everything. Well, actually, there's all kinds of evidence that Zuni people understood that there were living marine animals that had lived in you know what is now a desert, was once covered by the sea. They articulated all of that, and so that was clearly in their tradition. The other thing you may have remembered from the book, which I found really fascinating, was the extent to which Charles Lyell, the so-called father of modern geology, relied on enslaved people in the American South to tell him what was going on underneath.
That's right.
Because the plantation owners couldn't tell him about any of the fossils underneath the soil because they weren't the ones who dug the wells and so on. The
Yes.
enslaved people had done the work and recognized that these were animals and recognized that the sea had covered the land. So for one, I think one answer to your question as it pertains to the past is that many people knew a lot of things even earlier than scientists. And sometimes we make assumptions that there was some lone genius who came and figured it all out. So I like being able to debunk that assumption. But the really disturbing thing you're noticing is in modern times now, there's been something of a flip where the Americans are a bit more skeptical about science, although there's plenty of scientific skepticism in the EU as well.
Yes.
So the story you're talking about, and it's what led me to write this book. I was at a wonderful seashell museum in Sanibel Island called the Bailey Matthews National Shell Museum. And what you're referring to is a survey. And this was 10 years before I had been there, so it's not terribly recent. But there had been a survey of visitors, which were lots of tourists to Florida visiting with their children. And they wanted to know how much do these people already know about seashells. And that was where the statistic came from, that 90% of the visitors didn't know that a seashell was made by a living animal. Many people thought they were stones or rocks. And so that led to this book. I had been wanting to write a book about the ocean after the two freshwater books and then rain. This kind of completes the hydrologic cycle for me. And I wasn't sure how I was going to write about the ocean. And as soon as I heard that, you know, almost immediately, it really pinpoints the problem that you're asking about, which is what we're all working on all the time, right? There's this incredible disconnect between science and too many people, but also between the natural world. And I think the latter influences the former. You know, the more disconnected children are from something like fossils and seashells and mollusks, as opposed to Pokemon, which mollusks actually inspired those wonderful Pokemon characters.
Yes,
There's
exactly.
this huge disconnect with the animals themselves. I think the wider that disconnect becomes, the harder it becomes to help people understand science and cut down on conspiracy theories and all of these other things. And I'll say one more thing about this, Jeff. I was very shocked by that statistic, and I actually didn't believe it for a long time. But the more I went down there and talked to people, the more I talked to people on the beach, the better I understood it. And then, and the book has only been out 1 week, and I've already heard from several teachers who say, it's even worse than you realize. There are many children, for example, in interior Florida who've never seen the sea.
Not even in Florida.
Not even in Florida.
I'd say, okay, middle of Illinois. I get it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I don't have an answer to your observation, but I have that context that it's not just science communication that we have to work on. It's that physical connection to Earth and its life.
Right.
The connection facilitates that understanding.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
And actually, I mean, I'm sort of going to jump way ahead in the book.
That's okay.
It was interesting to me. You're talking about this. How do we reach people? They're not going to get to the beach, but how? And we can backtrack after this, but it used to be you just bring shells, empty shells, but now there are people bringing the animals. So there is that connection that there's an animal in there, and to raise awareness about, we just don't want to be collecting all these, destroying the animals and just disrupting the ecology. And so this is one of your clarion calls in this book.
Joanne, I'm glad you said that, because I keep forgetting to tell the end of that story, which I do tell in the end of the Seashell book. But the end of the story is that last year, unfortunately it was during the pandemic, but the Bailey Matthews National Seashell Museum, which used to be all about shells, is now the first, I think it's the first in the United States, that's an aquarium devoted solely to marine mollusks. So you go there now and you see, octopus swimming around and lightning whelk scooting around and, all kinds of fabulous marine mollusks, both from Florida and from outside Florida. There are cuttlefish, there are all kinds of neat sea snails that you might see in California or the tropics or the coast of Florida. So that is really important. And when you think about museums, the big museums, they have tended to had their stuff in drawers and the shells themselves, and then kind of out of sight anyway. And you don't see the live animals. It's kind of a diorama, right? So maybe that has been part of the problem, and it's important to get these animals in kids' hands.
It seems like a new insight and making connection with oceans that we talked a couple of weeks ago with Helen Scales about her new book, The Brilliant Abyss. And it's all about who knew that all that was going on in the ocean. And the answer is nobody really knew. And I remember from my youth a time when we thought the deep oceans were just empty and we could go and scrape nodules off the bottom without disturbing anyone. There's an amazing disconnect about what the ocean has done. And before anyone thinks, but before anyone gets the notion that you're using seashells as a pretext just to write about the ocean, it is about seashells too. I was amazed at how much interesting stories and all the whole thing that was actually about seashells, but it is about seashells related to those animals living in the ocean and what the ocean has done for us and what we're doing to the ocean. And that's where I'm back to my, I don't know what to do with your books. There's just all this stuff and it all goes together brilliantly. So
thank you.
And when I say poetic, it's like, I got a lot out of that, but I'm not really sure what the narrative was. Sometimes things just come along. But all those shells and all those animals and all that activity in the ocean.
Well, I'll tell you how I thought about the organization, but I wanted to mention Dr. Helen Scales. If you follow her
Yes.
Instagram and her Twitter, she shares these extraordinary images of creatures that live deep.
Mhm.
And she also wrote a wonderful book of seashells.
Spirals of Time. Spirals in Time.
Yeah, there are other wonderful seashell writers out here, but I don't think the American story had been told. And I
Mhm.
mean, not in a very long time. It had about 100 years ago, and then in maybe in 1950s. But what I wanted to do and how I tried to organize it, because Jeff, what happened when I sat down to write a book of seashells was that it was like trying to write a book about the world. It
Mhm.
is our home. A shell is a home, and this book is about our home. And so
Mhm.
the way I thought about it is that, if you hold up a shell, the pointy top, a gastropod, the pointy top is the apex. That's where the baby shell fit when it was just born, and then it
Yeah.
spirals its shell around itself. I thought of Florida, and specifically Southwest Florida, which, by the way, that's where I was born, and
Yeah.
that's where that sweet little seashell museum is. So I thought of Southwest Florida as the apex of my own life and of this narrative. So it begins there in Sanibel,
Mhm.
but it winds around the world. It goes to the Maldives and even to West Africa, and it gets to both the human story and
Mhm.
the scientific story. And the only way I could think to do this was to just pick 12 really iconic shells of human history. So, people had already written whole books about oysters and abalone. I have a friend named David Berger who wrote an entire book all about razor clams.
Oh,
So I
wow.
thought, well, the bivalves have had their own books, and I write about some bivalves, but I decided to take those really iconic shells, the ones that told the most powerful
Mhm.
story, and
Mhm.
build the book around those 12 shells. And then, of course, I open with the microfossils, so that added another
Yeah.
chapter.
Oh, I
But
love that story.
there,
I love
I
there,
that
love
story
that
too.
story. Alice, right, is the first name.
Carol Allison.
Carol Alice.
Yeah, so that was a beautiful story, and there is a lot of feminist science in this book, which was
Mhm.
partly me, trying to give voice to people like, even Miss Mary Elizabeth Lyle,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
who was a taxonomist in her own right. You don't see her name in Charles Lyell's books, but I can assure you she's there, right? So the story about Carol Allison, she essentially, I started writing this book and I said, wait a minute, what made the first shell? It wasn't marine mollusk 500 million years ago. It was something even before that. What was it? So I called this wonderful scientist, Phoebe Cohen at Williams College, and I said, I read this paper. It looks like you found the earliest evidence of biomineralization. She said, well, that actually wasn't me. I was following in the footsteps of another woman, micropaleontologist, who had found this evidence before Phoebe Cohen was even born,
Yeah.
and died of cancer before she knew what she had found. So Phoebe Cohen goes back to this same remote part of the Yukon with her colleague and finds more of these
Yeah.
microscopic beings who built the first shells. And one thing I loved about that story, she could tell they start building these spikes and armor for defense, because even back then she could see little drill holes where other animals had been trying to eat them. Other beings had been trying to eat them. So they start building shell, and that's what it's all about. So yeah, I love that story too. But I kind of had to figure that out before I could start the shell story.
Yeah.
And unless we don't have enough story threads intersecting, Sanibel Island and discovering that whole thing about the pre-Columbian shell cultures and things that have been destroyed by land developers who rewrite the history, which leads into other ideas about who gets to control the rewriting of history, and the story of Lyell talking to the slaves because they're the ones who knew, because the history of
Yes.
how America settled had been rewritten, and the disappearance of someone amazing like Julia Ellen Rogers,
Yeah.
who's been specifically written out of scientific history. Well, another very useful theme. And I think I'm sure some people might read parts of the book and complain that you're just being all feminist and putting this stuff in. But I thought that was a very valuable thread. It was a great contribution of reminding us about these people.
Yeah, it's funny. Someone commented that it was a feminist book, and my feeling about this is that I just went back and told the history. And if you actually do a good job and look under every rock and look inside all the seashells, you will find all the women.
Right.
It's not that this is a feminist book. It's that the history hasn't been properly told.
Right.
And
we're going to start talking about critical science theory or something now.
Watch out. I do teach at a public university where we're not allowed to teach those things. So
That's right. That's right. They're going to request your beliefs in Florida.
Right.
Say, oh my goodness, that's like frightening as anything.
To quickly respond about these great cities of shell, that wasn't just in Southwest Florida, right? That was everywhere. That was in San Francisco Bay, was surrounded by these incredible mounds that were flattened by 1906 when they were surveyed. The most amazing one to me is Cahokia, near modern day St. Louis.
Not too far. It's not too far from, you get two hours, 2.5 hours.
Right. And that there were mounds there as large as the pyramids of Egypt is just stunning. And and the other thing I love is the connection between the seashells of Florida, the lightning logs of Florida, and in Cahokia, but further here in Nantucket too, the shell mounds. The story is that there were permanent settlements and major communities all over the country. And the story that's been written is that there were, these were nomadic people, and that's just not the case.
True.
Things that would be described in excitable headlines as civilizations lost to history.
Right.
And I appreciate your pointing out that they're not so much lost to history as written out of history.
Yes.
To create a different history.
Yes, I came to think of seashells as the world's great fact checkers.
Yeah.
Right? They are archivists, and they hold these stories more accurately than the vanquishers who wrote down the stories, for sure. Yeah.
Right. You're talking about going all around the world. The book does go all around the world. And you mentioned many, many times a place I lived for 6 years, which is Guam. So my dad was in the Air Force. I lived on Guam for 6 years, middle school and high school. It's not like I lived in a house that I step outside and I'm on the beach, but yeah, it was pretty much there. The island is so small. And of course, I was introduced to so many shells. We had a beautiful conch shell. Money cowries were just everywhere.
Everywhere.
So they made little figurines out of these. And so we had a nice collection of shells. I don't know where they are. Military life sort of forces you to move and these things get broken and lost. But it was interesting. So did you go to Palau, or did you you went to Palau? So you were so close. So it's funny how
so close. I actually had to stop in Guam.
You did.
I think you have to stop in Guam sometimes. On the flight I was on, we had to stop in Guam, and I wish I had gone to Guam. My greatest regret is that I didn't go to Japan, because that story is really, really important. Hirohito was a great marine scientist and a shell lover, and the World War II story to this book is really important in a lot of ways. One of them is that it was all those American servicemen stationed in the Pacific Islands who came back with these beautiful tropical shells as keepsakes. That is the thing that caused the American shell madness of the 1950s. Right. And there was a crazy shell madness. If you read the Junonia chapter, there is just, it was just wild. People were, opening shell clubs all over the country, including in the Midwest. And just, everyone was crazy about shells and putting them in the mail to each other. There were all these mail order catalogs, but that, you can imagine those young men going to these tropical islands and finding these shells and just wow, and bringing them home. And then, then there's also a prosperous time in the United States that follows that period that enables people to travel. So I write about Anne Morrow Lindbergh there too. And what's important about her to me, and I didn't realize this until I reread The Gift from the Sea. She, in the 1950s, is talking about the culture of accumulation, and she's warning us about it. And when I read that book when I was young, that went right over my head. I was reading it for the feminist themes that are in themselves very gentle, compared with our Me Too era of feminism. But when you read her on the amassing culture, she's talking about seashells, but she's really talking about something else. She's saying, it's okay to collect one seashell. One moon snail there's only one moon in the sky. I think she says she loves the look of one moon snail instead of three. She loves the look of one shell on a windowsill rather than a windowsill jammed with shells. Yeah. And she's really saying something else about the culture we were becoming, right? And that was really interesting to me. And I think it's nice to think about that. She was saying, in framed space, beauty blooms. And I think that's a way to think about where we are as a culture and the transitions that we need to make to alternative fuels and the other places we need to get to. It is not a hardship. It's a better way of living. It's more beautiful. And so I tried to get that across in her part. I hope it comes across.
It does. It was very nice. And
it's a sort of anti-bouillabaisse philosophy.
You caught the bouillabaisse, Jeff.
Yeah,
sure. And that's very modern sounding, yeah.
Yeah. So, the bouillabaisse metaphor, I could probably talk for a whole hour on bouillabaisse, and I don't think I should give away this whole story.
Sure.
But I went back and read Yule Gibbons, and some of your viewers may be too young to know Yule Gibbons, but he was Wild Foods before Wild Foods were popular.
Yes. Right.
And he's sort of known for this sparseness, right? And living off the land and, eating wild leek soup and all these things. But when you read him on seafood, you realize that this is just, we've got to change our ethos. He would talk about, he would be, raving about spearing octopus in their holes along the beach in California to eat octopus. And he talked about bouillabaisse, which is still a popular thing, I think. But a bouillabaisse is a dish that takes a crustacean, a fish, and shellfish together. But Yule Gibbons said it was no good unless you use 3 shellfish, 3 crustaceans, and 3 different kinds of fish.
More.
It's just more and more and more and more. And that was our culture. And I think we're in this transition, and this is a good thing. It's not, it's the future that we have to look at with a little less, with eating, maybe a farmed clam, which I still really like to eat. I actually quit eating some of the seafood I eat after after this book, but maybe eating a farmed clam instead of a bouillabaisse is a better dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's yummier.
Well, our idea of what it means to live off the land has changed so much since the 60s, maybe more into
Yes.
what living with the land it does feel transitional. I hope it is.
Yes, and I think here on Nantucket, it's a very important part of the story because the scallops have really been devastated here, the wild scallops, and it's not one thing, right? It's not just over harvesting, it's not just pollution.
Well, I live very near the Chesapeake Bay, so that's an ever-present.
Yeah, so it's very, very much warming as well. Warming is very relevant to these animals. So it's not just going to be one solution either. It's not just going to be, oh, let's all eat aquacultured clams and scallops, which I believe will do, and I believe is an important part of this solution. But it's also, let's make these transitions that we need to make away from fossil fuels and toward alternative energy and these other things we're getting to finally. It's a really combination of things, just as it was a combination of actions that harmed the seas and the life in the sea.
Right, and we're like depleting past shells and current shells. And as a biologist, I did appreciate where you were talking about, okay, why can't we get more conchs to mate? And what's going on here? In fact, it was repeated over and over with many species of mollusks. Why can't we get them to mate? And there was a mixture of warming waters. They're too dispersed.
Yes.
If you've taken away a bunch, then there's one here and one here and one here. It's not close enough.
Yes. The chemicals had a huge impact on some of the animals, including Murex. I will say that I was in Puerto Rico last week with one of the researchers in the Conch chapter, Megan Davis. So there was one trip I didn't get to take because COVID was just starting as I was finishing, and I didn't get to go to Puerto Rico to see her conch farming operation. And conch farming is pretty promising. The great thing about it is that they have the fishers themselves. So the conch fishers, and this is a long time fishing economy in Puerto Rico. The conch fishers themselves go out and gather the eggs. So they will pick up a beautiful queen conch, take half the eggs, and then put her back on the rest of her eggs. Bring the eggs back to this area called the Nagoya Conch hatchery, and there they can grow up much more of those eggs into larvae and then into queen conchs than they would have a chance of living in the wild, and then they will all be placed back into the sea. And because conchs are deep water animals, can be deep water animals, it's a little more promising even if it gets any warmer than it already is there. So there's a bit more hope to that story than there is to some of the other shellfish stories. And, I'm writing a story about that now. I'm kind of completing that story, so I'm excited about that. But you may have seen just last week with this incredible heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, a couple hundred people lost their lives, and millions of shellfish, that were living on the rocks in British Columbia. You just see those incredible photographs of dead mussels and see the impact that heat is having on us and on marine life and also on our food.
Right. Yeah, that was pretty startling.
Yeah.
And I think for some reason you're talking about issues in the ocean. Of course, plastic had to come up.
Oh, yeah.
And I was actually surprised to start hearing, some plastic is being now interwoven within the shells, and we'll be able to, some researcher in the future will look, this was that part of time when they just
What amazed me, Joanne, is that there is no part of the world where a malacologist has opened up a bivalve and not found plastic.
Right.
No part of the world, and that includes polar regions where there are no people whatsoever, but the fibers from our yoga pants are in those mollusks. And I just want to say one more thing about Nantucket while I'm here, while I'm thinking about it. Nantucket has banned single-use plastic. You cannot buy it on this island. And that was, that was amazing. And that it took a while, but it went into effect. I think it's been in effect at least a year now. And, everyone is getting by just fine without single-use plastics here. You can't say that anyone in Nantucket is suffering. Because they don't have plastics, right? So, yeah. So these are things that can change.
They're hanging in there. And actually, jumping back just a little to the more and the everything, I went looking up pictures of some of the shells that, I've seen many of them by living on Guam. It all starts off with where you can buy shells, buy these shells, buy. And I was like, really?
Yeah, so
a big shell market.
Yeah.
Someone asked me, is there a big shell, like a big oil? And I wouldn't describe it as a big shell. The other thing people have asked me, which I have to admit I'm surprised by this question, and it tends to come from younger people, like my students' age, is it even okay to pick up a shell anymore? Given what we know about the world, and given that we know hermit crabs use them, and that hermit crabs are mistaking plastic for seashells all over the world and dying inside plastic, is it even okay to pick up a shell? And I would say that it is okay to pick up a shell, and that it's maybe even important to pick up a shell, especially if you're with a child, and that's, that child is getting some connection to nature, and maybe we'll take it home to the Midwest or wherever they live. But maybe it's okay not to pick up every shell on the beach. Maybe you pick up one shell, like Anne Morrow Lindbergh said. But the way that ties into the sale of shells and whether there's a big shell is, it's better to pick up a native shell on your beach, an empty shell, than it is to go into the beach shop at your beach and buy a tropical shell. Because that shell was very likely came somewhere from the Pacific Triangle, where the tropical shells are imperiled by over-collecting. And then it was shipped over here. The people who gather shells and in the industry are also taken advantage of, and they need solutions, just like those conch farmers in Puerto Rico are being paid pretty well to collect conch eggs. There are sustainable solutions for fishers in Indonesia and elsewhere that are the answers, rather than, being exploited to over collect tropical shells. So everything is connected. That's what I hope you took away from this book. I mean, I actually set out to listen to shells to see what they had to tell me about the earth and the ocean and its marine life, but they actually had more to say about people and how we live and how we treat each other. So, sometimes as environmental writers and science writers, I think we're maybe too micro-focused on that animal doing amazing things instead of its connections to human history and our obligations and justice and things like that. So that's why the book spiraled around the world, even to the Maldives, and came back around.
Speaking of big shell, though, and I don't think we should tell the story here at all. It's fine. It's in the book. Here you go. But perhaps you can reveal the original name of shell oil.
Well, I can tell you what the company was originally. It was Samuel Marcus's Seashell Curio Company in the East End of London. Samuel Marcus was a Jewish shopkeeper in London who opened his shop in the 1830s.
In
And
the East End, because you couldn't get better space if you were Jewish.
That's right. That's
Fine.
right. And he had a wonderful seashell shop. The shells that had been, I may have mentioned the earlier seashell craze among royalty,
For sure.
aristocrats, but then by the 19th century, that craze spreads to the Victorians.
Mm-hmm.
The Victorian middle class, and they all want to buy seashells. Marcus Samuel has the brilliant idea to import seashells to feed into that craze. And he imports beautiful seashells from Japan. And in the next generation, his son, Marcus Samuel Jr., founds the Shell Oil and Transport Company. And that is, as Jeff says, a pretty epic tale that I tell in a chapter called the Murex. And the first Shell oil tanker through the Suez Canal was called the Murex.
And it is so nice to know that it does not take 10,000 dead Murex clams to make
Purple dye.
a microgram of purple dye.
Purple dye. Yeah, I was surprised in that chapter, like how, she's following, as a woman, right? Following the instructions, and instructions on how to collect dye from these shells.
She's following Pliny.
That's what I thought. Right.
And she's like, wait a minute, he never really made this dye.
Nice of him to document something he didn't do.
Exactly. Enslaved people were actually making that dye, so I think he glossed over it a bit.
And
there's more critical shell theory.
Right.
So he, you're talking about the collecting dye, but the end of the book reveals some really cool possible science of the iridescence of these giant clams and how those could be helpful for solar power.
So toward the end, you had asked me if I traveled to Palau, and I did. I traveled to Palau with Allison Sweeney, who's a biophysicist now with Yale, and she is actually studying the properties of giant clam illumination to understand it as a possible inspiration for alternative biofuels and solar energy. So clams are basically big biofuel plants sitting on the shallows of the Pacific, taking in billions of microalgae and fueling themselves with that food with the help of sunlight. And so, these animals are inspiring a lot of really fascinating science. So I write about that science, and of course, Megan Davis and the aquaculture part is another very important part of the solutions. And then another scientist I write about toward the end of the book is Mandy Holford, who is working on venomous mollusks as potential human cures. They are working on molluscan toxins for everything from painkillers to cancer cures. She's actually identified a toxin from terabrid snails that can kill liver cancer in mice. And so she has a long way to go for human trials, but it's really amazing. So I wanted to show by the end of the book the extraordinary human ingenuity that is out there and underway, and this shift that is happening. But we've got to protect the seas and, stop climate change and stop contributing to climate change to get to these new ways of living and these wonderful innovations.
In passing, you noted that something like someone had told you that they estimated that in medicines and things that some 80% of antibiotics and other very useful drugs had biological origins. And
yes, And with and mollusks are a relatively recent part of that. I think just in the last 40 years ago or so, most of these cures have come from plants and trees and the like. So the marine creatures, everything from jellyfish to mollusks are really important.
It's a confession about that is that for a long time I thought it seemed kind of a thin justification on the part of conservationists, let's say, to say, well, we might find drugs in these plants and these animals and these mollusks and things, so we'd better be careful. It's like, well, yes, we might. And so as a specific thing, it seemed a bit thin, but I'm starting to see it in the same way seashells as metaphors for everything, that it's really a type of discussion that the things that we get via these drugs, which is a very specific, concrete thing that we can understand or relate to, is symbolic of a bigger. We don't even know what the resources contain and offer, and we don't appreciate them.
Yes, it's such a great point, Jeff. And I have often felt the same way you did. Sometimes when an environmentalist or a marine scientist will say, well, here's why we have to save the oceans. We might be, there might be a cure for cancer there. It felt, mercenary is the wrong word, but I'll use that word. That word is too strong, but that's how it felt. But you're right. It's the symbol of the whole. And it's the important part is listening to nature. We have been so arrogant, right? That arrogance comes through in this book in so many ways. And it was also true of those medicines, right? The chemical companies would find something and then they would send it to the lab and try to make a synthetic version. They would spend a couple of years trying to make a synthetic version when the, evolution had done it better. And that is what Alison Sweeney is saying about the giant clams. Let's listen to what nature has been telling us for, a billion years, because we can live better with the help of the animal world. And so that's what it's about more than any one cure for any one thing.
Plenty of symbols like the picture of land developers plowing down ancient or historic unique resources of these shell buildings in order to crush the shells to make concrete to pave roads is a really powerful symbol. I think that's going to be with me for a long time. And it's so, I was so irritated by it.
It's so irritating. The one that got me, Jeff, was that alligator effigy in Louisiana. Wouldn't you have loved to have seen that? There was a huge alligator effigy that was taken down to build roads. Just incredible.
Well, it was just some statue by some old people who weren't even very sophisticated.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of destroying things or taking advantage of people, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Nagoya Protocol. Some people may or may not know about this. I'm a biologist, so I do.
Yeah.
The importance of these discoveries.
So the Nagoya Protocol was part of the Convention on Biodiversity to try and protect. So you heard, we talked a little bit earlier about some of these places where the shells get taken away, right? The shells are getting taken out. Those animals are being killed, but also marine animals from the Coral Triangle and many other parts of the world, such as the Brazilian forests. These things were being taken by major chemical manufacturers or by Western scientists to, to come up with cures and do their work without regard for the people in those places. And there are some really painful stories when you look back at history about colonial science and what happened. So, really important objects like you might remember that shells things like wampum here in our country, but shells in other parts of the world, they weren't exchanged as money so much as truths and cultural artifacts. So many of these things were just taken by archaeologists, earlier archaeologists. It was the same in the ocean. You know, people were just taking creatures, bringing them back to the United States or to the EU and discovering things, and nothing would go back to the countries. There's a very dramatic quote in the book. I don't have it in front of me, but someone said, you know, the tropics were our supermarket. We could just take anything we wanted. And so the Nagoya Protocol was meant to prevent that from happening anymore. So it protects some of the smaller countries or more developing countries to be able to strictly control who can take their marine life and other resources. Well, the problem with it is that it's sort of backfired, so that now scientists who are doing some of this work, who are working with Native people and wanting to share this, you know, with all humanity, are in some cases being kept from doing the research they need to do. So it's still a very controversial topic, and it is not worked out. But I had one scientist tell me that it's the number one barrier to his marine science in the Pacific Triangle right now. So it's a very, you know, very current and timely issue, and it's got to be negotiated with people who live in these places, and not just by the bureaucrats and scientists and people who are paid to fly somewhere and be in a room.
Right. Yes, it's so true. You know what? I'm looking at your book. I have an ARC, so I don't have the full one, but can we give a shout out to your artist?
Absolutely. I am so glad you did that, Joanne. That's been something I've been doing on my Zoom book talks, has been showing her artwork. The artist's name is Marla Coppolino. She lives in Ithaca, New York. In her day job, she works for the Cornell Ornithology Lab.
Oh, I love that. Their app is great.
She is a trained malacologist, and she is a fantastic scientific illustrator. So, you know, my idea here was that I wanted to help people get beyond the seashells. Now let's get beyond the seashells and think about the life inside.
Yeah.
So looking for an illustrator, I kept asking malacologists who would be really good at this. And her name came up. I want to show you my favorite. This is what the book author copy looks like with all the Post-it notes in it.
Right.
My favorite is the bay scallop.
Oh, yeah. Look how beautiful.
I just love it so much. And she really got the eyes. And she really, I go swimming with these guys in the Gulf of Mexico. So I can tell you that she really got the motion, which is so hard to do, right?
I'm not 100% sure the ARC has every illustration.
I think it does, but we were still tweaking them. We were still tweaking them by the time, So I'm
really glad there's some in here. So.
I appreciated the accuracy too, and the fact that it was the shell that you were talking about to illustrate. Some people don't think that's particularly important, and I think it's exceedingly important. So I appreciate that.
I loved that she captured the beauty of the shells and the personality of these animals.
Yeah.
And they swim and hop and skip and do somersaults. And sometimes you hold one up and it seems to look you right in the eyes with its crazy tentacle eyes. And she captured all that, and I was just thrilled.
I was looking at the conch, and you just see her eye coming out like, hey
the conch eyes are so great, and she also accurately shows that there's vegetation growing on the backs of conchs. When you see a queen conch in the Bahamas, it is not a shiny pink thing, right? It is really covered with green algae and all kinds of vegetation, and she really captured that.
So it's great. I'm so glad that those pictures were included in there. They're very charming and well done.
Yes.
So,
I will tell Marla you said so, and she'll be really excited. When I had the book launch last week, the day the book came out, she came on the first book talk with me, and I introduced her, and we showed, you know, her illustrations next to the live animals, so you could really get a feel for it, and that was a lot of fun. Yeah, Marla Cocolino, everyone.
Yeah, Jeff. Maybe her thing just ended. So hi, we don't know if Cynthia will join us again. Let's see if she comes right back. So yeah, it's hard for me to say which Cynthia's back.
I don't know what happened. Guess I got so excited about Marla Cocolino that I just exploded. But now I'm back.
Yeah, it's like surely this is an accident and not a 1 hour moment kick out. I'm like, do we ever do that? So
before we quit, usually we don't do this, and it's time to stop and everything, but there was one quotation that was one of the themes we talked about earlier, and I think just because it was the longest quotation I wrote down, because it just, I don't know, it irritated and energized me so much, and I would like to read that, and then I absolutely will stop.
I can't wait to hear what it is, Jeff.
And just after this, you had, in a short one, you were quoting G. Stanley Hall, whom you said, and this is quoting you, he and others insisted that boys needed books written by men. Okay, that came after this discussion of Julia Ellen Rogers and such. And here I'm quoting a paragraph that you wrote. And to me, it was like all those people who keep saying, well, why weren't there more women in science and the arts and things? They probably just weren't as good at it or something. It's like, okay, quoting, I puzzled over how Julia Ellen Rogers could have vanished outside the shell world, especially having been in Liberty Hyde Bailey and Anna Comstock's influential sphere of nature study at Cornell. Her name never appears in Comstock's autobiography, published by Cornell University Press in 1953. In the wearying pandemic summer of 2020, amid headlines filled with public distrust of science, the answers finally reveal itself. A Cornell researcher and nature study historian named Karen Penders St. Clair uncovered an egregious tale of how a chain of editors and colleagues suppressed and rewrote Comstock's story and that of the early nature study movement, end quote, because they thought boys needed stories written by boys. And that's all in there, but I want to entice people too and say that there are so many stimulating topics in this book that
thank you. And that when the story of nature study in the progressive era, somebody has got to write a fabulous book about that. In fact, when Last Child in the Woods came out, because all that earlier history had literally been written out of history by the person who whitewashed Comstock's biography, none of that was out there in the public record, and that story isn't in Last Child in the Woods. And I think it would be a really neat story of itself. And in fact, some of the kids who learned nature study in school include Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson. And then nature study is abolished around World War I because of what you just said. People thought that children needed to just read science books written by men. They didn't need to be going out looking at snails and holding
the over-feminization of science
and looking at bird eggs. That was all women's stuff, right? You know what you made me think, Jeff? Maybe you could invite Karen Penders St. Clair to be on your show, and she has updated Anna Comstock's biography. She went back and restored it, so now Cornell University Press has published her actual biography, the longer one that wasn't censored by the people who just wanted to write about her husband. And Karen would be a great person to have on the show to kind of bring that book back to life.
Excellent. To be bulging with stories to come out. But there we are. Now we know more about it than we did before.
That was the chapter that after I read it, it just kept lingering in my head. I'm like, really? It's this bad? I mean, we knew it's this bad, but it's this bad.
Yeah, I would like to write a bit more about Julia Ellen Rogers, and she probably deserves her own biography, and she even her Wikipedia page is full of inaccuracies, and I meant to go fix her Wikipedia page after I finished the book, and now I haven't really had time, but you're both reminding me that I am going to do that soon.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah,
maybe we'll commit to trying to talk to Karen.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah, I'll look more into it. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up because this is important. So, well, Cynthia, we are past an hour, and I just wonder, is there anything you wanted to add that maybe we forgot to bring up?
Oh my gosh, I think you brought up so much, but as a closing thought, I would just say, there are dark moments in this book because of the history that exists, but the mollusks, in the end, they're incredible survivors, right? They lived for these 500 million years. They survived the mass extinctions. They have a lot to tell us. They are inspirational for how we can live differently, for how we'll protect ourselves from storms, even from biofuels. And the human side too, there are some dark moments in that human history, but ultimately, we have just been incredible innovators. And that is what I hope people take from some of those stories. Even at the end, when I end on the west coast of Africa, I've learned about the cowries and the slave trade, but I've also learned about the first tidal energy plant will now be built on the coast of West Africa. I mean, that is very exciting. And so I hope that it is inspirational for the way we can live in the future.
Yeah, it's great. What a great book. And by the way, I'm just going to show the front pages.
Oh yeah,
the illustrations.
The frontispiece is wonderful, isn't it?
It's beautiful. Beautiful. So relaxing is what I think. Anyway, well, Cynthia, thank you so much for being here and talking about your great book. Again, for those who may have just popped in, it's The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of the Oceans. And I think every time I've tweeted about this, I've forgotten an S or added an S, or is it plural, is it singular? But
I noticed that there was a little Twitter dispute about World Oceans Day versus World Ocean Day.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, it probably doesn't behoove the environmental community to be fighting on Twitter about what their hashtag should be.
Yeah, for grammar, it's grammar, right? It's
right. It's understandable. So it's understandable because there's always some debate about whether we should use ocean or oceans. But I ended up going with oceans, plural.
I think one time I put Sound of the Seas, and I followed up with a tweet. No, the Sound of the Sea. And I'm like,
it's an historic, poetic plural. It's understood. Yeah.
That's right. Oh, thank you so much. I hope you have a great time on Nantucket.
Oh, thanks. I will. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Yeah.
Happy summer to you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in.